Thank you, Winnie. So my name is Ed Brown. It's not a typical Norwegian name. I was born in France, Paris, and I was adopted by American military people, moved to Michigan and Texas, and then Hawaii and Washington State, and I lived in Alaska for 3 summers as a tour guide, and I lived in California, and now I've lived in Norway for 30 years. Yeah, so I moved around. And my job takes me to all over the world. So the work we have is in North Korea, for instance. I've been there twice. If you're interested, I can tell you about that. It's not a fun place. I wouldn't recommend it for a holiday or a honeymoon. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkmenistan, India, Pakistan, Burma, Myanmar. So our work is all around the world. We are a Christian missions and human rights organization, which raises eyebrows. Often my Christian friends would say, but what's this human rights business all about? And I say, well, it has to do with human dignity. People are created in God's image, and we should treat people like human beings, regardless of who they are. That's what we talk about, human rights. Okay, well, that's all right, then we can get behind that. And my human rights friends, they'll often say, but this mission stuff, isn't that forcing people to become Christians? And I say, well, listen, every other year, when I walk down the main street in Oslo, Karl Johan, it's called. Anyone been to Oslo? Okay, so you've walked down Karl Johan, I guarantee it. You walked by the Parliament building, and so every other year there are a bunch of booths that are set up, and there are people there trying to bribe me. They're offering me water bottles and candies and pens, and they feel like if I would just be like them, the world would be a so much better place. Mm-hmm. Now this is political ideology that they think can change the world, but they want to convert me to their way of thinking. And so I asked my secular human rights friends, should we stop that kind of bribery that's going on, this corruption? No. That's not corruption. That's just simply sharing what you believe. It's political freedom. It's freedom of speech. That's what I mean when we talk about mission. People have something they want to share with other people. Mm-hmm. And mission is so much more than that, of course, as well. Mission has created hospitals and educational institutions and helped people around the world, millions and millions of people. Well, if that's what it's about, then that's okay. And our form of mission is we don't send missionaries, we work with local people. Christians who are under pressure. It's our task to help them, strengthen them, so they can continue to be salt and light where they live. And we do it the way they want to do it. We listen first. So in Iran, where there are many people coming to the faith, well, actually more people are leaving Shia Islam because of the way the Ayatollahs have said that this Islam has to be very, very strict. People are saying if that's what it is, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Most people are becoming nothing. They're leaving Islam for nothing. But a significant number are becoming Christians. But there are no Bible schools, there are no seminaries, it's not even allowed legally to take converts into your church. So how do you educate? How do you have discipleship? How do you raise a new generation of leaders? So we help with local partners to create an underground, a secret system with Bible training and with pastoral training. That's what we do because that's what the church wants there. But the church next door in Iraq, they're saying, we've had a church here for 2,000 years. We know how to disciple people. But we've just had the Islamic State that's just decimated our country, and they've killed us, and they've created tensions between the religious communities. Can you help us bridge those bonds? Mm-hmm. And one way to do that is if you help sponsor some of our business people who lost everything. They were just destroyed. But they're good business people. Mm-hmm. Help us start businesses so the Christians can hire Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims and Yazidis and Kakais and Zoroastrians and Baha'is so that we can rehumanize one another. Mm-hmm. We can see each other, look each other in the eyes and become human again to each other. So we can build down the tension. So the next time tensions arise, we can talk with our neighbor and maybe they won't be the same sort of horrible situation that happened before. So that's the situation there. In Chin State, in Myanmar, up in the northwest, bordering India, the 7 sisters of India come around there. They say, listen, we're a very poor state. The government has negligized us because we're a Christian state. We don't have any hospitals in our entire state. We don't have any airports. We don't have any higher educational institutions. We have Bible schools. So we have enough pastors. Can you help us establish a university where we can have a bachelor's degree in business so our young people don't have to go elsewhere to get an education? We lose them all. Okay. So we help them establish a bachelor's degree in business. That's helping the church. We listen to the local people. And on the human rights side, we defend the rights of all people. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, atheists, whomever. we will stand up for the right. I think of Mubarak Bala. He's an atheist in Nigeria. And he lived sort of secretly for many, many years. And then he saw a video of Boko Haram who had beheaded a Christian woman. And he said, this is horrible. I have to also stand up for my faith, or my non-faith, my atheistic tradition. And so he started writing about it, and he was promptly arrested. And he was taken to psychiatric treatment and given drugs and beaten and tortured. And finally, when he didn't recant and become a Muslim again, he was then put in prison. And he's sitting there now. So we defend the rights for him. We've written letters on behalf of Mubarak. That's us in a nutshell. Missions and human rights. Sorry, that was too much, but...
And you've just incorporated here.
Correct. So we are you mentioned, thank you, we started in the Cold War. Originally we were called Mission Behind the Iron Curtain, 1967. Our name has changed. Stephanus refers to St. Stephen in the book of Acts. And as you know, the first church, they weren't even called Christians, they were followers of the way. They were doing what the Old Testament prophets had said, taking care of the widows and the orphans. But they were discriminating. So the Greek-speaking Jewish converts were put in the back of the queue. And the church leader says, this can't be this way. We have to treat everyone equally. So they established these deacons, and Stephanus was one of those deacons. And then so we're on the same side of the Stephanuses who were standing up for those who were being discriminated. And then he was the first martyr. He stood up for his faith, and we're on the side of those people as well. So we've existed since 1967 in Norway, and we feel like we've been doing a lot of good work around the world. And so just recently, just a few months ago, we got our 501c3 status here in the United States as a nonprofit organization. And we're hoping to build bridges also with churches here in the United States.
What kind of issues would you engage in this country? Or what would your work be here?
So we believe in partnering. So as I mentioned, on the mission side of our work, we support the church out there. But we also believe in bringing the faith stories back to the church in Norway and then the church here in the U.S. to strengthen the church here, because we're not under persecution. I know some Christians might say they're being persecuted for their faith, but it's not anything like what's happening in Pakistan or in Nigeria or in Myanmar or many other countries. And so how can we help strengthen the faith here? And then secondly, how can we as a body share with other parts of our body? So if you look on the table over there, we have, let's see, did I put it here? We have advocacy letters that we produce on behalf of someone or groups of people who are being persecuted for their faith. In this case, this one has to do with Nicaragua. So we have a regime that's oppressing everybody, but often the Catholic Church is one of the strong civil society institutions that stands up against the regime, which means that the priests and the bishops are in a very, very difficult situation. I can't remember, maybe 20 or 30 priests and bishops have been arrested recently. They've either been sent to exile or they've been put in prison. And so this is on behalf of one of the bishops and among others. So we've written a letter. Here's what you get. You get an introduction to the case. You will get a follow-up on some earlier cases that have gone on. And then you have a letter. It's written for you. All you have to do is sign it, put a stamp on it, and send it to the address we've given you. In this case, the Nicaraguan embassy in the United States, to put pressure on the government to do what's right. And it will vary from case to case. And like I said, we have Christians, we have Muslims, we have atheists. They will take up their cases. And you can be part of helping getting people released from prison. Then we believe in prayer. I shared with it earlier, and you'll hear me again. When I meet the church out in the world, whenever I say goodbye to them, the last words they say, remember to pray for us. We take it very seriously. So we have a newsletter that we send out. We're just transferring things over to the U.S. now. Everything is geared up in Norway, and we're not exactly sure how we're going to do this and how we're going to get names on our database. But we take it very seriously. Do we pray for our brothers and sisters around the world? And we want to make sure we get information, reliable information about that. So those are some of the short ways in which we think we can partner.
So as you know, when we do if there's a microphone right here, if you have a question, I see one. If you come to this microphone, people on the live stream can hear you.
When you were talking about the people leaving their faith in some fundamentalist ways, I've always been fascinated by the principles across religions that are so similar and the same. Is that part of theology about Christianity attractive to, say, someone who's leaving a Sunni Muslim? Can you begin at the ways Christians and Muslims agree as part of your outreach for bringing them to the Christian point of view?
Okay, thank you. First off, we as an organization, Stefanus, we don't have a way of doing things. Again, we listen to the local people, and they may have different ways. And one of them may be dialogue. It may be saying, how do we discuss with one another our commonalities? For others, it may not be. We don't have one way of being Christian. And I would feel very uncomfortable as a Westerner coming to traditional Christian countries and telling them how they should be Christians. So dialogue may be one of them, but as an organization, we stand up for the principles of human rights. And religious freedom indicates, one of my friends is the former UN Special Rapporteur for freedom of religion or belief. And he likes to say that religious freedom is a peace project, but it is a non-harmonious peace project. So it differs from dialogue. Dialogue often looks to bring together people to find commonalities. And unfortunately, it's often men with funny hats and big beards, and they talk together, and the women are excluded, which is not a good thing. And so we get commonalities, but more than half of the congregations or the people their voice isn't even heard. So we believe that a non-harmonious peace project tells us that we don't have to get along. We can live together peacefully, even though we disagree. So our task isn't to find commonality. I mean, that's fine if that happens, and that's a good thing. But if we don't find commonality, we still can succeed in living together peacefully by agreeing that we don't have to agree on things. But we can agree that our children are dying of dysentery. And how can we as Christians and Muslims and Buddhists work together for the benefit of our children or for the benefit of our community, even when we disagree? So there are dialogical aspects to the work in those areas where they want to do that. And there are diapraxy, working together to bring us together.
I almost feel like asking it without the mic.
Don't do it.
Hey, good morning. In light of humanizing, how do you foresee humanizing all these principles in light of AI?
I will be attending what is called a ministerial in October in Germany. It is a place where a government, it started with the United States in 2018 and 2019, and it's gone to various governments around the world, where the government invites ministers, usually ministers of foreign affairs, could be ministers of development, to meet together to talk about religious freedom issues. In addition, they invite civil society, so I'll be attending, and the theme is religious freedom and artificial intelligence. I don't know the answer for that yet. But I do know that challenges for religious freedom based on AI have a lot to do with the ability of governments to actually reach into the lives of people and to monitor them to a much greater extent. And then, okay, now it'll get a little technical, so those of you who want to take a little nap right now, please feel free to do so. But okay, religious freedom has three aspects to it. I mean, there are more, but three key ones. The right to have, the right to change, and the right to practice your faith. The right to have is what we call the forum internum. That's inside of us. The state never has the legitimate right to interfere with that, ever. The right to practice now, there could be legitimate grounds for the state to intervene and limit some forms of practice. I think of the ancient Aztec religion of human sacrificing. If that were to start up again today, it would be not only right, but needed that the government stops that form of practicing your religion. What we're seeing is that it's always been that the government has always intervened there, sometimes illegitimately, often illegitimately, but it hasn't been able to get in here, in your head. AI will allow you to do that in a completely different way, and we don't know the ramifications of that. So I'm hoping to learn something more. So if you invite me back after the meeting in October, maybe I'll have more information about that particular question.
I have a follow-up while you all are deciding who goes to the mic next to the last question. When you were talking about us as a place where there isn't religious persecution, where we should learn about that happening around the world, which of course we should. I think Americans are very disconnected. And often in our liberalism, in the grandest sense of liberalism, not in the political sense, I think sort of treat the rest of the world like it's more backwards than us. And so, especially if we're liberal Christians, that we wouldn't have those relationships or be responsible for Christians around the world, which I think is we're wrong. I think we're wrong about that. And it kind of just feeds our own sense of our exceptionalism, right? We're so special. We're so special. And you all are definitely special. We are special. But would you all ever imagine working on religious freedom and the kind of diversity within democracy that you're talking about in this country?
Not in a direct sense, most likely. Our criteria for working in a particular country have to do with, is there rule of law? And in the United States, you might argue that it's been a degradation in it, but it's still there. We still have a constitution. We still have independent courts. Again, we might question about how independent they are, but compared with other countries, I can tell you they're very independent. So in Iran, you don't have independence. In China, you have no independence whatsoever. You have a legislature which is separate from the executive branch. And you have a strong civil society that is still able to organize and still able to protest on its own behalf. You don't have that in Iran. If they do, they're hammered down. So our criteria to work is in those countries where that isn't present, where we can make a difference. I don't know if we can make much of a difference here. Now, indirectly, if you, again, look on the table, we have some booklets on freedom of religion or belief. And if you go to, let me just double check here, dry erase. You'd be surprised how often people put a permanent marker right here, and you think you're writing with a dry erase, but it's not. So it does say dry erase. All right.
They both do, yeah.
All right, well enough. If you're
Next time, it's a test, right? Yeah.
If you search for learning platform. So in addition to those written materials on what religious freedom is all about, we, together with a Swedish organization and a Danish organization, have created digital online learning resources. And I think for many people, we need to be reminded what religious freedom is about. It is not about privileges for my community. And I think we, as you were just saying, we get caught up in our feeling as though we are the ones. Let me just ask, did Christianity start in the United States?
In Texas, actually.
In Texas, okay.
Yeah.
I was further south. Yeah, okay, so Texas, yeah. And that may be the narrative that many American Christians, I come from. It's been so eye-opening for me as a Protestant American Christian to travel and meet with the ancient church of the East. An ancient church with their rituals that is totally foreign for me and so enriching to realize that the ways in which we worship God can be very, very different. And I learned at a young age as I was traveling around, I could either take the stance that the way that I learned from my original place is the right way in all the things I do, and everything else is wrong, or most things are just chocolate and vanilla. And so I find that the enrichingness of the Christianity I find in other places in the world has been incredible for me. And I think that's, again, we can bring that back to the American church to realize it doesn't have to be so myopic. I was sharing with you in the break. Do any of you ride a unicycle? So I told my wife once that I'd read an article that said that people get old. I mean, we all age, right? But we get old faster because we stop learning new things. And so she bought me a unicycle. So I've learned to ride it, okay? And it's almost like riding a bicycle, but a million times more difficult. But part of the principle is the same. Next time you're riding a bicycle, try to stay on a narrow line or stay in a narrow path by looking down at your front tire. You won't be able to do it. If you focus only on what's around you, you miss the big picture, which means you lose balance. If you want to have balance, you have to lift your gaze, follow the horizon, which means you still see what's happening here around you in your peripheral vision, but you have a much bigger picture. If you lower your gaze, you lose that vision. And I think the body of Christ, not just in the United States, but in Norway and Western Europe, has often had a very myopic view of just ourselves, which has mean we become very insular and we become very strange. I think the term weird is applied. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. We are weird as a people. And we need to get out of that, and that can help enrich us. So if you're interested in learning more about religious freedom, search for that, and you'll be provided with some digital tools to learn more about what it means to be really open to religious freedom and a level playing field for everyone.
Can you say that acronym again for weird, what that means?
Yeah, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Yeah, and just very quickly, FORB means, okay, in the United States, because you have the First Amendment, religious freedom is the term, but that often can be exclusive of non-believers, atheists, agnostics, freethinkers. So in Europe, we've coined the term freedom of religion or belief, and this refers to, again, too technical, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which starts with everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. And the conscience was put in by the Russians or the Soviets that said ubestania, which means conscience, which means also non-religious. So we throw in religion or belief to incorporate every human being, regardless of who they are. So don't get hung up on that. FORB Learning Platform. Take a look at it.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us. This is amazing. So as you enter the U.S. as a 501c3, who do you see as your collaborative other NGO partners in the U.S.? And obviously, I am very supportive of the Carter Center. And how do you work with the others in that venue?
Thank you. So we are a collaborative organization. We believe in alliances and working together. We're stronger when we work together. So this is a collaboration with our friends in Denmark and in Sweden. If we look at our two sides, the human rights side and the mission side, so we've already over the years have a very good collaboration with the U.S. State Department. So they're international. They're in the State Department. You have two offices. One of the Office of the Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, very small office with the ambassador, which is an appointee from the president. And then you have the IRF office, International Religious Freedom Office, which is about 40 individuals. I was just there last July. They invited me to hold a course for their staff to teach them more about religious freedom, and specifically religious freedom and how it intersects with women's rights. Because we recognize religious freedom doesn't stand alone by itself. It interacts with other rights. Sometimes they're in tension, not inherently in tension, but they can be in tension with one another. And how do we get over those tensions, and how can we actually work together? So why should a woman have to choose between her faith or all her rights as a human being? She shouldn't. She shouldn't have to choose that. And so we're working on that together. So very strong ties, collaborations with the State Department, with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I just on Thursday had a meeting with the Carter Center. So, yeah. So we're looking at ways in which, and what I suggested was maybe, if I'm invited back again, maybe we could do something in collaboration, have a seminar where we invite people and talk about global religious freedom and how that works in a domestic set and how they work together with one another. So if someone invites me back, maybe we can do a collaboration somehow with them and the Episcopal Church. And then we're looking for collaborations with all sorts of others. On the mission side, hoping to engage with churches, individual churches, but also denominations who would say this would be something that would enrich our body of Christ here locally.
Can you go back and talk? So how do you approach that? I think when many people who are not religious think of religion, one of the first things they think of is that it is oppressive to women. So if you're doing both human rights and religious freedom, give us an example of working on that intersection.
So we had funding from the Norwegian state for the last 3 years to hold a series of workshops Originally, we had the workshops on a global basis, so we invited the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights as a two-man team that works on faith and rights. We invited them. We invited a number of ambassadors. We invited people from the CEDAW Committee, which is the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Again, I'm sorry, this is very technical, but talk with me afterwards. So high level at the UN, we invited those experts to discuss what are the key areas, the tension points between religious freedom and women's rights. And from that, we then did regional workshops. We invited religious actors, women's rights actors, and to some extent LGBTIQ actors. And we invited diplomats to participate. And we created a safe space, and the feedback we got afterwards were women's rights activists, LGBT activists said, this is the first time we've actually talked with religious actors. Because often we're sitting in each of our, what's it called? Sorry, Norwegian is in my head, and so fallgruve. Do you know that? Well, it could be silos, but in the First World War, with trenches. Thank you. There you go. So they're sitting in their trenches shooting at each other. And this is the first time they've gotten out of their trenches and come across and talked together as human beings and realized that, yeah, actually, fighting for religious freedom, the ways in which people are oppressed because of their religion are similar in the ways in which women are oppressed, and women doubly so because they often are religious people as well. And how can we maximize those rights? So again, my friend Heiner Bielefeld, the former Special Rapporteur, he says too often when we find rights in tension, we take one of two approaches. One is the trumping method, nothing to do with the former president. It's basically saying which right is more important. Right. Now, those of us who work in human rights, we know they're all equally important. But it's easy to fall into that sort of way of thinking, well, as a women's rights activist, women's rights are more important than religious freedom. And as a religious person, religious freedom is more important than women's rights, and you're stuck in your trenches again. The other is to compromise. Well, let's find out what we have in agreement and the least common denominator. They said neither of those really is the best. What we need to do is have a mindset that says, how can we maximize both rights to the greatest extent? And if we're looking for that, we will find better solutions than if we're looking at the other two. And that's what we approached. How can you, as a women's rights activist, as a religious activist, how can you work together to promote to the maximum extent both religious freedom and women's rights?
Isn't it fascinating? I was just thinking about being an Indian, because you brought it up this morning. So I was thinking about it, that under the Indian Constitution, women have rights. Under the American Constitution, we don't. Right? We actually don't. Right? We get absorbed into some. But so what that means, though, in India, there's a freedom to practice religion. So it means that when your right to not have caste discrimination or to not have gender discrimination conflicts with your religion, you can go to court. And so part of what's happened is in Hindu temples, Dalit people have gone in and say, I have a right to be here. Women have gone in and say, I have a right to be here. That could be applied to church, which is an interesting way for women's ordination to happen in Orthodox churches, is literally if you showed up and said, I have a right to be here, that's technically true. Same for a mosque. But interestingly, your religion has rights in this country, but basically the rest of the law doesn't technically apply to your religion in this country, which isn't like the human rights language is not our starting point. We're not as robust in many ways as other people with newer constitutions.
But I think one of the problems, again, we're weird people. We think that we do everything better than everybody else as Americans. And I got to tell you, I mean, if you go back to our history, we're a country of immigrants taking in ideas from all over the world that have benefited us when we've been willing to lay aside our pride and accept that maybe other people actually do things better than we do, and we can maybe learn from them. So that's a huge challenge. So the international human rights scheme, the U.S. officially agrees to most of it. They've signed on to most of the international treaties, not all of them. But they think that the American Constitution is better and above in all circumstances. But it isn't always. And I think we could learn more about what religious freedom is about. Because you mentioned something, religions being protected. So at the end of the day, human rights, and religious freedom is one of human rights, Article 18, it doesn't protect religions. No religions are protected. No ideologies. It protects people. Human rights are about people being protected who might adhere to or be part of a religious community. And by religious, it's very important to identify. We tend to think, especially in a non-sort of Catholic sense, we tend to think that religion is all about one dimension, namely faith, dogma. If you believe this, that's religion. But religion can be also a second dimension having to do with practice. In India, it's very, very important what you do. What you believe in is not as important as what you do. If you are in a rural community, you contribute to the various festivals. If you do not, it's a big problem. And then the third way, which I think is the way in which most conflict occurs, not through dogma first, but is through identity. We belong, this is our group, and our group is threatened, either real or perceived. And I see this happening in the United States with this rising religious nationalism, Christian nationalism. And we think that our group is threatened, and that legitimizes our use of violence against those who threaten us. And it becomes justified through a dogma, but that's not what comes first. And I see this all over the world. So I had 3 different conversations yesterday with people, and I explained what I do for a living. They said, yeah, religion is the root of all evil, and it's the source of all conflicts in the world.
Right.
And I said, well, let me temper that a little bit. Let me push back a little bit and say, religion is often a contributing factor, but economics plays a huge role, access to natural resources, politics certainly plays a role, and identity politics plays a huge role. So it's a much more complex thing. So we as an organization, we don't want to dumb things down. We want to make sure we look at the complexity of the world and we do our best to try to make things better. And sometimes we inadvertently do things wrong and we want to roll back and try to do things right. We don't think we can win in a sense of creating heaven on earth. Well, we can try to make things better, which means constantly changing. Back to my unicycle. Balance is not about a stationary, static point. It's always about movement. It's always about adjustment.
Well, one of the ways this is playing out in our country, again, our human rights framework is not very strong, but the protection of religion and religious practice. And so one of the ways, I'm sure you all have seen this, it's fascinating, where religious practice is not protected, it's contested, is in Florida and other parts of the country, but specifically in Florida, we all remember when it became illegal to help people who were unhoused. Right, to give people water or food. And so people, religious people specifically, continued to do it and were arrested for doing it.
Yep.
On the border in Arizona, specifically, I think that's the most well-known. There were religious groups putting out water for people crossing out in the desert and arrested for doing it, and continued to do it to contest the idea of religious freedom. Right? I had friends who were ready to sue the state of North Carolina for equal marriage, saying that they felt as clergy, it was their responsibility to pastorally respond to their congregations. In the 60s and 70s, clergy were part of the leadership on reproductive choice in this country, saying they were pastorally tending to their flock who needed medical care that was denied by law. So we have this wonderful heritage. The civil rights movement is the strongest of all of these, right? Riding buses together and showing up and registering people to vote. We have this really powerful witness that is about religious freedom, but interestingly in this country isn't framed that way. Like you don't think, because if we framed it as religious freedom and we remembered it historically as religious freedom, we're for that. You got a lot of freedom in this country to practice your religion, but it gets framed as activism or something else. But it's religious. It's the practice of religious freedom.
Well, I know our time is running out, but let me just from all of history, and especially if you look at the Reformation, all religious groups claimed religious freedom was important for them because they often broke with some other group. Either in dogma or in practice. Yep. And they said, we have a right to practice this way or believe this way. And you, as the state, it's the formation of nation state at the time, so it's more kingdoms at that point, and the church have to give us this freedom. And they would create their new groups. And then groups within them would change their beliefs and want to break from them and said, we need freedom. But then the new mother group would say, no. And they would enforce. So the danger is anyone who gets into power, and this is again balance again. My fear is that just like on riding on a unicycle or walking a slack line, if anyone's done that, big motions are very seldom good. Because it creates a new big motion to counter that motion. That small incremental changes is what keeps you in balance. And that's hard when things are so bad.
Yeah.
But I've looked at it through the lens of history. Erica Chenoweth is an American scholar who's written about change, revolutionary change in the world, study from the 1900s to today, and looked at violent revolution as opposed to slow, peaceful revolution, and which ones bring about more lasting change. And it's very clear. Peaceful, which is much more slow and means a more violence to the group that's trying to bring about the change, is one that lasts more and lasts better over a longer period of time. But it's very difficult to do when our brothers and sisters are suffering and being beaten and killed.
You know, our church just had General Convention, so that's when our national church gets together every 3 years. And one of the phrases that was used throughout the convention, because the missionary diocese of Navajo land was established. So it was a missionary area. It was very moving. The Diné people came and spoke, including one woman who remembered not being allowed on the floor, and her community praying for her before she was to go on that floor as a place of basically a contested and violent place, the floor of our convention, right? And the phrase they use that is one of theirs is walk in beauty. I'm going to start using it because it's gorgeous. And they use beauty in the way that in the Celtic prayers, behind us, ahead of us, below us, beauty. And what it means, apparently, is balance. It's this deep, wise, ancient sense of what actually can be sustained, which is what I think a little bit of what you're talking about. It feels like a huge concept to me. I'm going to spend some time with that. I hope someone invites Ed Brown back, because clearly we have more conversation to have as a congregation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.